So this video is probably improperly named. We've talked about solutions a lot before. Maybe continuing introduction to solutions would be a better name. Alright, so a solution is another way of saying we have a homogeneous mixture of two or more substances. In solutions, because they're homogeneous, the mixing is taking place at the individual level of atoms or molecules or ions, depending on what our substance is. And we're typically not able to see the boundaries between the components of a solution. Unlike a heterogeneous mixture, where the mixing is taking place more at the macroscopic scale, and we do see the boundaries. When we have a solution, there are two major components, right? There's the solvent, which is the substance present in the greater amount, and a lot of the times, the solutions we've been dealing with to this point, and really that'll be true going forward, the solvent is water, but it doesn't have to be. And then the solute is the substance present in the lesser amount. And so we say that the solute dissolves into the solvent. And the process of dissolving is also called solvation, or sometimes dissolution. Now, as I said in the previous slide, a lot of the solutions that we've dealt with in this course and in lab, water is the solvent, and then we often have ionic compounds dissolved in that as the solute. But it doesn't have to be the case. The solute and solvent can each be any combination of the common phases. And so a solution where both the solute and the solvent is a gas, an example of that would be air. Right? So air is roughly 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and then various small percentages of other things. But that is a solution where the solvent is a gas, the nitrogen, and then the oxygen and the other minor components could be thought of as solutes. An example of a liquid-liquid solution would be alcohol, like you drink. Wine, for example, is often about 12% alcohol, right? But the other largely 88% is mostly water. Of course, there's sugars and other things in there as well. But at least the two major substances in wine would be water as the solvent and ethanol, a liquid, as the solute. An example of a gas where the solute is a gas and the solvent is a liquid would be soda. Right, of course, there are other things in soda, but the carbon dioxide that's dissolved in your carbonated beverages is the solute, or one of the solutes, and the solvent is, in that case, water. A gas-solid example of a solution. These are maybe less common, but for example, hydrogen gas in metals, it turns out there's a lot of open space, if you will, in metals, and we can fit a lot of H2 molecules in there. And so people that do research on fuel cells, rather than, if you're going to drive a fuel cell car, you might not want a tank of hydrogen under high pressure. That'd be in danger of exploding if you were in an accident. But you can also dissolve large amounts of hydrogen in something like palladium, where it's not under high pressure and you're not in danger of that exploding in some kind of a car accident. And then a solid liquid solution. I'm not going to put anything down there, right? There are so many examples of things that we've done. Sodium chloride dissolved in water. Sugar dissolved in water would all be examples of solids dissolved in liquids. So the next thing that I want us to consider is the energetics and the role intermolecular forces play in the formation of solutions. So when we form a solution, there are all kinds of intermolecular forces going on. Right, we have the intermolecular forces that exist between two solvent molecules. We have the intermolecular forces that exist between two solute molecules. And then we also have the solute-solvent interactions. And so we typically have, if it's a two-component mixture, three different types of intermolecular forces. And depending on the relative strengths of these, they might help us form the solution or prevent the solution from happening. If the solvent-solvent and solute-solute interactions are very strong, and the solvent-solute interactions are really weak, then it may be the case that we can't form the solution. The solvent and the solute are unwilling to break up those interactions to form new solvent-solute interactions, and in that case the substances won't mix. We won't form a solution. And so we've talked about looking at what types of intermolecular forces exist in a sample many times already, and I want to sort of do the same thing here, only now for mixtures. So I've got two different compounds interacting, and what would the intermolecular forces be between them? So if we had heptane and pentane, so these are both hydrocarbons. They only contain carbon and hydrogen. So they're going to be nonpolar, and they're both nonpolar. So then the intermolecular forces that would exist between those two would be London dispersion forces. Okay, let's look at the next one. So we have a mixture of acetone and chloroform. So we can see the picture of acetone here. So we've got oxygen-carbon bonds. We definitely have polar bonds. We can see from the figure that it's not symmetric. So we certainly have a possibility of dipole-dipole interactions. None of the hydrogens are all connected to the carbons. So acetone isn't capable of hydrogen bonding. Then we have chloroform. So we've got the carbon here, hydrogens, the three chlorines. Carbon-chlorine bonds are definitely polar. The molecule is not symmetric. The chlorines are all on one side, so this side is going to be partially negative. This side is going to be partially positive. And so those two molecules would interact with dipole-dipole interactions. All right. The mixture of ethanol and water. So this is the mixture going on in our alcoholic beverages. Water is polar, certainly capable of hydrogen bonding. Same thing with ethanol. We've got a carbon-oxygen bond and carbon-hydrogen bond, so we have polar bonds. It is not symmetric. We have hydrogen directly connected to an oxygen in both molecules. So they actually both meet the more stringent requirement for hydrogen bonding. So water and ethanol, the intermolecular forces that exist between those two molecules is hydrogen bonding. And then this last example, we were introduced to this intermolecular force before. We haven't seen any examples of it because we haven't done any mixtures to this point. But here we have a sodium ion interacting with the dipole moment of water. And so this would be an example of the ion-dipole intermolecular force. All right, we've already talked about the energetics of solution formation a little bit, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. So one thing that we often do in chemistry is when we have a process that sort of takes place all at once, but a number of different things are going on, we sort of do a thought experiment where we decompose that process into the individual things that are happening. And so when we form a solution, there's sort of three things going on. One, we have to break the intermolecular forces that exist between the solute particles, right? We've got to break the solute apart. We've got to break those intermolecular forces. And we have to do the same thing with the solvent particles, right? And then when we bring them together, once we've broken the intermolecular forces between the solute particles and the solvent particles, then we can bring those together and form new intermolecular forces between the solute and the solvent. Now, of course, in reality, all of this happens at the same time, but we can often make our study of the problem easier by breaking it down into these different pieces. All right, and so when we form solutions, those processes can be either exothermic or endothermic. And we've broken down, and so in this case, we have an exothermic solution formation and an endothermic solution formation. In each cases, we have the three pieces broken down, right? So we're separating the solute particles, right? So the solutes are further apart. Then we're separating the solvent particles, so the solvents are farther apart. So now everything's separated, and then when we bring those together, we might call this the enthalpy of mixing, right? That's the energy given back when we now form the new interactions between the solvent and the solute. And we have the same thing here on the right-hand side. We've broken it down into the three different pieces again. And so you can see we get an exothermic process when the enthalpy of mixing, so the heat we get out when we mix the solute and the solvent together, is greater than the enthalpy required to split the solutes and the solvents from one another. Right? When the opposite is true, when these processes require more energy than we get out from mixing together, then we'll have a net endothermic process. And so one thing you may wonder, why do we see endothermic solutions forming at all? Right? If we have to put heat in to make that happen, why do those solutions form when we just mix them together? And the answer is something called entropy. So entropy is a measure of energy randomization or energy dispersal. And so it turns out nature tends to want to spread its energy out. And so this is also sort of related to disorder. And when we think about entropy, this isn't the most formally correct way to think about it, but conceptually it helps a lot. Entropy is related to the disorder on the molecular level. And so when things are very ordered, we have less entropy, and when things are disordered or messy or chaotic, we have high entropy. And it turns out when we want to consider whether a process will happen or not, we have to consider both enthalpy, the heat, and the entropy, the disorder. And so why do endothermic solutions form? Well, it's sort of disadvantageous to form them from the enthalpy standpoint, but whenever we form solutions, it's always favorable from an entropic standpoint. And so whenever we're thinking about whether something will happen, we always have to consider both the heat, the enthalpy, and the disorder, the entropy. And I wanted to introduce this now, but we'll swing back and we'll talk a lot more about entropy towards the end of the semester. But I at least wanted to kind of throw this out for you and kind of give you a little preview of this very important topic in chemistry.